Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Hassler, director of the Wick Poetry Center, and we are absolutely thrilled to host tonight's reader, Pádraig Ó Tuama, who's been with us for 2 days now, leading several workshops and visiting our students. It's been such a rich experience, Pádraig, and we look forward to bringing you back in person on the other side of this pandemic. Tonight's reading and in fact, both events have been co-sponsored, and we're very grateful to John Carroll University Peace, Justice, and Human Rights Program, as well as to the Kent State University School of Peace and Conflict Studies. We're also grateful to the Ohio Arts Council for their generous support, and to the Wick family, to Bob and Walter Wick, who have endowed the Wick Poetry Center in memory of their sons, Stanley and Tom Wick. Many of you have heard Pádraig's voice in his very popular podcast, Poetry Unbound, with the On Being Studios. And his voice will sound very similar, because we've been told, Pádraig told us that this is where you see him. He records in the cork line room of his country home, those beautiful translations and explications and humanizing of poems for our everyday lives. Poet and theologian, conflict mediator, Pádraig centers his work around themes of language and power, conflict, and religion. He's the author of 4 books: Daily Prayer with Corrymeela Community, In the Shelter, Sorry for Your Troubles, and readings from the Books of Exile. He works fluently on the page and with groups of people, as we've witnessed these last 2 days, yesterday and today, and is a skilled speaker, teacher, and group worker. I would go so far to say a group healer. So please join me in welcoming poet Pádraig Ó Tuama.
Thanks very much, David, and thank you to everybody who's been involved in coordinating this visit, to people at John Carroll and to people at Kent State and the Wick Poetry Center. I'm so pleased to be with you all. Thanks to David. David and I met each other in New York State a few years ago and have been in touch ever since. And it's been a great joy to be a part of this. And to Philip Metris too, who arranged some of the visits to classes looking at peace and justice. I'm going to share some poems with you tonight. I'm going to share some poems exploring the question as to what do we notice about power. I've got 12 poems lined up. I might get to all of them. I'm most excited about the possibility of some Q&A. So I'd be thrilled if you put some questions into the chat or if there is a Q&A function, and then we can get to those. That's the most exciting part of it for me. It's nice to meet people. But I want to look at poems under 2 headings. One as knowledge as power, and the other as vulnerability as power. So I'm kind of, for the sake of tonight, pitting knowledge and vulnerability against each other. And I don't mean the kind of knowledge as wisdom. I mean a kind of, I suppose I mean an addictive kind of knowledge, an addictive kind of hanging on, an exclusive eradicationist point of view when it comes to the question of knowledge. So let's start off. This poem is called The Tree of Knowledge. This is a sonnet. It kind of builds on the idea of the tree of knowledge that is narrated in the mythology that you find at the beginning of Hebrew Bible. I'm speaking about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of knowledge. Having eaten only one fruit from it, we cut the tree of knowledge down. We broke its boughs, ripped it from the land it fed and fed from. Some man made branches with machines. Some woman cut new leaves from steel. The tree sent up its sighs. lamenting that the land it held together could no longer now be held together. From the tree's remains we manufactured paper, but words kept on appearing on the pages with warnings that we didn't want to read. We burned it, dumped it, waited. We wanted something else to save us. Sometimes we're thinking about noticing last night and today when it comes to poetry, and sometimes we think that we don't know something enough and so therefore don't act on it. The word noticing comes from the Latin word meaning to know. And when it comes to questions to do with climate change, we're not just noticing things. We know enough already to be seriously at risk and seriously culpable if we don't do enough to respond to it. And so there is a way within which there can sometimes be a thing to say, well, we just need to gather more data. I think that's an abdication of responsibility. Here's one about the impact of living, speaking in a language that isn't native to your own country. So many countries know this all around the world. So many territories, so many groups of people have had their language taken from them. And this is a poem called Mother Tongue, but the M is in parentheses. Is that what you'd call it? We'd call it brackets. So it's mother tongue or other tongue. Growing up with two tongues in my mouth, I said yes in one, but not the other. Conjugating subjunctives before I knew what conjugating was. Praying for forgiveness in a language with no verb for love. Hinging sentences on a free tense because there's truth in subjectivity. Learning lines about the hunger that drove us to the West. Repeating the poetries of dead men whose hope died before they did. Harvesting old sods, colluding with illusions of an unpartitioned people. Minding and reminding lines of history. Learning them by heart. One of the technologies of colonization is to make the people who you're colonizing unfluent in the language they'll need to use to negotiate their own safety and freedom and what we would call now human rights. And I think this is an old technology, a terrible technology. We have a phrase in Irish, Tír gan teanga, tír gan anam. A land without a language is a land without a soul. And you see how striking to the heart of a people's own fluency, their negotiation, their idiom of speech, the language that has been evolving in their bones for hundreds of years and in their collective memories and in their collective literatures, oral and written for hundreds of years, to find a way to eradicate that quickly by imposing a language of empire. That does something that is more than simply linguistic to a people. It removes a question of the inheritance of a soul from you. One of the ways within which that was done in Ireland was to manipulate a potato blight into a famine. And so here's a poem about that. This is a villanelle for any of you who are interested in form. A villanelle takes two lines and then tumbles them by repeating them over and over throughout a poem. Form, in this sense, is a really good way to think about how is it that I try to hold and masticate two thoughts that I want to be chewed up together and thoughts that I'm slightly obsessing over. You'll hear what the two lines are. What you need to know for this poem is that when you... Well, for a couple of things. One is that the word spuds in Ireland, we mean potatoes. I'm sure it's the same in parts of the States, but maybe not everywhere. So spuds is that when the potato blight arrived in Ireland in 1845, there were all kinds of soup kitchens set up. And my great-great-grandfather was 6 years old at the time, and he was taken to the soup kitchens with his brother and with his parents. And he never saw them again. They got lost from each other and presumably died. He only spoke Irish. and he was brought in by an English-speaking Protestant family who looked after him for 5 years till he was 11. And then he went to the city to get a job and to see if he could find his family. And the story in our family is that every day off he had for the rest of his life, and he lived till his 80s, he walked as far as he could, asking news about his family and presumably news about their graves eventually once he accepted that they had died. So here's a pantoum, or here's a villanelle called The Famine. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. My mother likes her peace and her diet magazines. My great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. At the heart of every famine is the scheming of a state to bring a people to their knees for the state's convenience. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. On the phone, an Englishwoman says the Irish are fixated with our stories of the past in a way that's quite obscene, but my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. My auntie moved to England and learned how to translate between the way a people are and the way their history's been. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate. There are proteins in our grass from forgotten famine graves, some families fed on rotten grass, and, my mother tells me, my granddad's granddad was the only one who made it. His family had all starved, so he missed his confirmation. Decades later, a priest arranged it. Didn't make a scene. My father likes his spuds piled high upon his plate, and my great-great-granddad was the only one who made it. So far in all these poems, I think one of the things we are seeing, and one of the things that I'm hoping to circle around in this selection of poems, is the ways within which knowledge can be exploited for the subjugation of a people. And we have seen that in so many empires around the world, and also internally in countries, the ways within which privilege is used not to share or make accessible or make more just opportunities that are there, but in order to continue subjugation and domination. All of that comes from a very impoverished imagination about the question of power, that there's only a certain amount of it, and so therefore keep it all for yourself. I'm going to keep on with some of these poems like that for a while, and then we'll do a little volta, a little turn into thinking about vulnerability. My studies are in theology, and theology is a great way to study literature and to study poetry and to study form and to study narrative as well. And there's the story that you might know from religious background or studies in religion of Abraham. And Abraham was told to bring his son Isaac to the top of the mountain and to be willing to sacrifice Isaac. And when I had heard this Bible story when I was younger, I heard it being described as a demonstration of great faithfulness, that Abraham was so faithful to God that he was willing to kill his own son. And I remember being frightened because I didn't think that sounded very much like faithfulness at all. I thought it sounded like a megalomaniac. But then I felt guilty because I thought I'm probably not allowed to have those thoughts. And then years later, studying theology, I started to make some friends who were Jews. And it was with them that they were like, oh, that whole idea that Abraham was demonstrating faithfulness, that's only a theory. Lots of people think he was crazy. And lots of people think that his approach to what he was doing was demonstrating a profoundly dysfunctional family. After Abraham was about to sacrifice his son, and he didn't because an angel appeared and said, don't worry, there's a ram over there in the thicket. Kill the ram instead, the poor ram. Isaac never went back down the mountain with his father. Isaac went into the desert where Hagar, who had been enslaved to Abraham and his wife Sarah, had been sent into the desert to die. And so Isaac, who almost died at the hands of his father, went into the desert. And Isaac never saw his father again. And Abraham died without blessing his son, which is kind of like saying he was cut out of the will of dignity and the will of name, because that's what would happen. And Isaac grew up absolutely obsessed with the question of inheritance, so much so that his twin boys manipulated him into the question of which one of us is going to get the inheritance, because they were twins. Which one of us is going to get the inheritance? And there's a way within which we see what Freud would call the repetition compulsion occurring through this whole family line. And you can read in this profound text of the book of Genesis the way within which human systems and family systems have always been as sophisticated as we know them, and that dysfunctional families are nothing new. The Bible's full of them. There's a poem called Family Tree. They say Satan teased Sarah while her husband tied their son up on a mountain. It's an old story. A man tests the limits of religion while the devil's on a mission to a woman. The devil said, "He's dead." Oh, wait, he's not. Sarah heard a gunshot and did the only thing she could. She reached beyond herself and died. Meanwhile, Isaac sees a frenzy on the face of a patriarch and an angel screaming out a name, and everything's going dark. Afterwards, they never spoke again. One went his way and the other went another. Isaac's mother dead, he followed Hagar to the desert. Hagar married Abraham, but Isaac stayed away, didn't even send a text. He pulled the blinds down, tried to rest. Then his father died. So God blessed Isaac. Isaac never quite recovered from the loss. Then Rebecca came along and saw it all. She'd studied Freud, so knew her boys would tell stories that their father couldn't bear. She tore her hair out, then devised a plan. But even she was foiled. Her boys grew up. Her boys forgot the fights of childhood, spat out bitter herbs, and limped towards each other when the angels settled down at last. There may not be a God or a Sarah. There may not be a garden or a man who ordered soup up to his room. There may not be a mountain, but there's always been a woman with the truth, and there's always been a brother full of shame. There's always been a story, and there's always been a devil in the details. I tied some of these poems together by little references that they have. So here's a poem about the devil. When I was 18, in fact, the week after I was 18, I was put through an exorcism. I'd taken a kind of a volunteer position with a religious organization, and I'd had to fill in information about my sinful life, which hadn't been very juicy, unfortunately, but I had to fill in information about that before I took this volunteer position. And I'd had to tick a little box that said that homosexuality was a sin I struggled with. It didn't even occur to me to lie. I wish it had. And anyway, somebody told somebody, and a person from the country of California was enlisted to manipulate me through a loud exorcism when I was 18 and a week. But 25 years later, I started to turn to those experiences, because there was 3 exorcisms, and I started to write about them in a sequence of sonnets called 7 Deadly Sonnets. All of this is a long time ago, and it did teach me about how time can be its own healing too. It didn't strike me that the people who were doing this could be the bastards they were being. I was determined to see them in a good light, which meant putting a demon in me, demonizing my own understanding of myself. It also didn't occur to me that they were just either manipulative or idiots because they thought that this was true. I didn't have any form of confidence in my own thinking to think that what they were calling knowledge was profoundly manipulative. So here's a sonnet called The Exorcism. I do like Americans, by the way. So the first line here doesn't speak about you all. The Exorcism. I wish you weren't American. I wish you didn't see intrinsic evil in me. I wish you hadn't dragged my secret from me. Now I know you knew already. Someone squealed. I wish you hadn't put your hands on me while you were screaming at the devils in me, all my homosexualities. I wish you'd never gathered people round, instructing them to pray in tongues or read from Revelation or chant, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wished you'd shut up, and I repeated, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. I wish he'd answered. I wished you dead. And I was frightened at the violence in me and the nest of demons in me. I wondered where they lived. In my semen? In the dreams I had of being kissed? Why did they breed in me? My God, my exorcist. I don't think I could have written that poem if had I tried. I was writing poems desperately to save my life all the way through this time, but I don't think I would have been able to have written that poem as a young man. And I'm very glad for the passage of over 20 years before even the idea occurred to me to turn towards those experiences and to write about them in art. Because I feel like I'm narrating a much younger man's voice, and I'm far away from it now that I can think about the artistry of it as well as the anger of it. But it's not an anger that's present, it's an anger that comes from the past, and that is a really healing thing and a saving thing to be able to touch into that anger now when I can turn it into something creative. And that, I think, is partly what I think is needed in the question of moving from an abusive understanding of knowledge as power to a creative understanding of knowledge as power, is the question about how anger and creativity and vulnerability can all be held together in the same space in order to be creative with the language we use in public. So I've got a few poems about that. Let me see. Here's one called L is for Lonely. This is an old one. This is an acrostic poem. The first lines of the words spell out the word lonely, L-O-N-E-L-Y. L is for lonely, because that's what I've been. O is for ordinary, because these days it seems to me loneliness is ordinary, and ordinary's fine, and ordinary is going to be here for a while. N is for the nothing, and the nothing's not lonely. The lonely is just ordinary, but the nothing is void. Lonely I can deal with, and ordinary's fine, but the nothing truly scares me with its deep, vacant eyes. E is for everyone, because everyone's a little I. Everyone's a little lonely, a little happy, a little shy. Everyone's and anyone could be me, the poor and the persecuted, the pure and the sleek. L is for licking the wound where I inscribed on my own skin with my blood ink the yearning I can't hide. And Y is for yonder, and yonder's not here. And right here is yonder to someone who's not here. And yonder rhymes with wander, and wander rhymes with love, and all love is a little lonely, made with ordinary stuff. I heard somebody talking years ago about the idea of nonviolent resistance, and that sometimes saying something vulnerable when you're in a situation of violence might be the surprise that changes the situation of violence into something else. And one night, years and years ago, 15, maybe almost 20 years ago, I was walking home from Belfast back to my house. It was only 2 miles. I'd been out with some friends for a few pints of Murphy's. And I was walking home and I saw somebody on the other side of the street and there was nobody around. And I just got nervous. And so I began walking a little bit faster. And then the guy on the other side of the street ran across and accosted me and started to scream in my face, screaming, screaming, screaming. He was so wound up like a tightly coiled spring on the absolute knife edge of violence. And even though I'd had quite a few pints somehow in my mind, I thought, I wonder if I can try that little thing that I'd heard about. And this is a little thing that I think was probably advised by a man to speak to other men, because I think this is an entirely gendered experience that happened. So I said to him, because he kept on saying to me, I'm going to fucking kill you. I'm going to fucking kill you. And I said, I'm really frightened. And he stood back and said, what did you say? And I said, I'm really, really frightened. And he said, fuck off. And I did. I ran and had something stronger than a pint when I got home. And I'm struck by how, when I heard that at the time, I thought, my God, that's an amazing piece of information. But now when I think back on that, coding that I was given was to say, here's a way that men might be able to survive the violence of men. There was no imagination that such a tool or a technology or an imagination would be relevant to any women who have to face those kinds of situations on a very, very regular basis. Here's another story about a time when I was in a pub and some violence happened. Any of you who've been to the north of Ireland will know that, the north of Ireland is under Westminster government as part of the United Kingdom. And so we use pounds sterling here. We don't use euro. And the banks in the north of Ireland can produce their own money. And so you'll have Northern Ireland £10 notes or £20 notes. And it is sterling. It is the same as the Bank of England, but they just look a bit different. But it's exactly the same, just looks a bit different. It would almost be like as if the Bank of Alaska could produce its own Alaskan dollars, which are exactly the same as dollars from the mainland of the United States. Anyway, any Irish person who goes, any person from the north of Ireland who goes across to England regularly keeps a stash of Bank of England money, because you know that when you go across and you go to pay for something with money from Northern Ireland, they're going to say to you, oh, that's Irish money. And you're like, for God's sake, you colonized us. Why don't you know the situation? This is British money. Anyway, that happened. I was in a bar with a friend and we were about to have some pints in England, and this happened. Enjoy your pint, this poem is called. At the bar in an unknown part of Birmingham, I bought 2 pints and paid with paper money from the northern part of Ireland. That's not British money, the publican said. And I said, yes, it is. You'll see the royal head if you hold it to the light. And a man standing right beside me turned to me and looked and said, so you're from Northern Ireland. He was wearing denim jeans and a denim jacket, tobacco fingers fixed around a half-drunk pint. He locked his eyes on me and moved so near I could have kissed him. Whose side are you on, son? He whispered. Whose side are you on? And I didn't know the landscape of belonging in this part of England. I hadn't seen signs enough to know whether his hope flew for the orange or the green. He continued to look. He continued to keep close. And I said, I hope for peace. And he said, that's a clever answer, son. That's a very clever answer. And I said, I know. Enjoy your pint. And I got up to go. Here's another poem about 2 other characters that were mentioned already, Jacob and Esau. They're the twin sons of Isaac and Rebekah. And when they were younger, they were, one's described as hairy and one's described as smooth. One's described as intelligent and the other's described as ruddy and hardworking. They are painted in this deeply archetypal way. And they fought a lot. And in fact, they manipulated their blind and death-obsessed father to where the younger one would get the inheritance rather than the older one. And they are portrayed as a kind of a smooth, subtle diplomat and a hungry ogre of a brother. And what's strange is that, they're estranged for many, many years. But then, many decades later, they have this moment of meeting. They take a great pilgrimage to each other. They each journey for days to a borderland where they can meet. And along the way, they each fight their own demons, and they've each brought all kinds of gifts to exchange with the other. And they don't stay reconciled. I mean, they don't start fighting again, but they go back to their respective homelands. But somehow, toward the end of their lives, they did enact a gesture where they realized that the things that we fought about as younger men, as younger brothers, as younger siblings, have changed now. And I like to think that for men, we shouldn't have to take that long. That we could come into that sense of vulnerability and wisdom without waiting until we're 70, and that we could begin as 15-year-olds, as 25-year-olds, as 40-year-olds, to begin to face up to the violences that we enact. And this poem is called Jacob and Esau. One day, I repented my resentment because I realized I'd forgotten to repeat it. For a while, no, for a long while, it was like a prayer rising to the skies morning after morning, like a siren that wouldn't quiet. And then I remembered other things. The way I walk lighter these days. The way you never knew my story of divorce. The way I am tired of being forced among the new. The way I miss having someone to speak to about things I don't need to explain. The way we shared a name. So I decided. I took a flight and hung around the areas where we used to meet. I loitered with intent. I was hungry with hope, but couldn't eat alone. I missed the home your body was, even though we're grown now. I missed your smell, your wrestle, your snoring breath. And when I saw you'd changed too. So much behind us we didn't need to name. So just two more poems for you, and then we'll have some Q&A. I'd be thrilled to engage with you in Q&A, so lash any poems into the question and answer that you want. I might live to regret saying that, but I would be delighted. It's always nice to hear what things are going through people's minds. This poem is called How to Be Alone. When you see the title, it's called How to Belong, but then the word belong is crossed out and be alone is put in there. I do think that there is a necessity for us to be alone, a necessity for us to have a certain sense of boredom and come to the limitations of self without distraction. Because I think it is there that the most creative possibilities happen, where we come in contact with the fact that we may not be sufficient company for ourselves, and that we have loneliness, and that we have edges, and that we have old voices that raise up in us that we don't know how to quiet, and that there are parts of us we meet where we realize, oh, I need some support. I don't mean therapeutic support, although that might be the case. I just mean the support of company and friends. I think a life lived without the possibility of coming to that edge of yourself is likely to be a life where you may not be able to navigate your own edges. And so when I think of groups and individuals who are good at being in groups and able to be around groups, I think that one of the skills there is knowing how to be alone, and that can help you know how to be with others. So this poem is called How to Be Alone. It all begins with knowing nothing lasts forever, so you might as well start packing now. In the meantime, practice being alive. There will be a party where you'll feel like nobody's paying you attention, and there will be a party where attention is all you'll get. What you need to do is to remember to talk to yourself between these parties. And again, there will be a day, a decade, where you won't fit in with your body, even though you're in the only body you're in. You need to control your habit of forgetting to breathe. Remember when you were younger and you practiced kissing on your arm? You were onto something then. Sometimes harm knows its own healing. Comfort knows its own intelligence. Kindness, too, it needs no reason. There is a you telling you another story of you. Listen to her. Where do you feel anxiety in your body? The chest? The fist? The dream before waking? The head that feels like it's at the top of the swing, or the clutch of gut like falling and falling and falling and falling? It knows something. You're dying. Try to stay alive. For now, touch yourself. I'm serious. Touch yourself. Take your hand and place your hand someplace upon your body and listen to the community of madness that you are. You are such an interesting conversation. You belong here. And for the last poem, I suppose I want to say that just because I think that mixing vulnerability and knowledge and an awareness of your own anger and the possibility of creativity, just because I think those are tools for living, it doesn't mean that they're tools for certitude. We will all feel confused, and I think that's the point. It is the imagination that we won't be confused is the thing that can, one of the things that leads to danger. I decided a number of years ago that I was going to read through all the poems of Emily Dickinson, all 1,775 of them. I take a new poet every year, usually, although not always, a dead poet who has a lot of work, and think over the course of this year, I'll just read their books slowly. I read other books along the way, but I like to stretch out a poet over the full year. Anyway, it took me 2 years to read Emily Dickinson's work, and by the end of it, I had less of an understanding about who she was than I had at the start of it, and I was transfixed by the power of her language. She takes 26 little letters with question marks and em dashes and creates not just a new planet, but an entirely new universe from the way that she imagines what it means to be alive. And I felt foreign and wild to myself. And also I was aware that the possibility of language was constantly surprising, and not surprising always in a good way, surprising in a way that makes you pay attention. And so here's a poem reflecting on that. It's called Let the Waters Swarm with a Swarm of Living Beings. I've been swimming around here for a while now. And while I've never touched the ocean floor, I've tried. You notice things out here. The way the wind makes waves chop at odd angles. The way the water feels warmer at the top. The way the moon makes music when you're half dead with cold. The ways of frozen bones. The way the morning never feels the same. Once a seal bumped me, came right up to me like a sea puppy, and I swear it smiled. I was floating happy after that. I said the ocean was my home. Then the storm came, then the waves, then the lightning spiked the surface, thunder clapped. Hungry beasts swam around me. I saw seagulls eyeing me for scraps. So over to you, David, and the questions.
Thank you, Pádraig. Such a beautiful reading. I see many folks repeating lines of yours in the chat, and 2 questions already have appeared in the Q&A. We could begin with Leah Thornton, who asked the question early on in your reading tonight: what other kinds of transformations of anger into art do you see happening around us in this time of inflammation?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think we're always in times of inflammation. I read an article in a well-known poetry journal recently that talked about the recent political change in poetry. And I thought, my God, you lived a luxurious life, this person who was writing the article. They were, because, I mean, I grew up in Ireland where poetry in Irish and English has always been political. There's been such a long history of trying to come up with metaphors for writing about the oppressor without exposing yourself to torture and execution by the oppressor. So at the age of 9 and 10, we were learning about metaphor for keeping yourself alive. So I suppose there has been a very long history in countries that have been occupied of using the arts for communicating information, for communicating resistance, and for amplifying that within the context of also staying safe enough to be able to do that. It is why in so many places of oppression you see artists also being singled out, musicians, poets, writers, and why also you see propaganda is always trying to mimic artists. And propaganda, I think, is an empire's recognition that art is important. Let's see if we can trick people with art. So I think all art can be a vehicle for expressing anger. And I think that can be really important to pay attention. Yeah.
Wonderful. There's a second question, not a leapfrog to the chat, because early on, Mary Chadbourne asked in the chat, she said, can you expand on what knowledge that is not wisdom in regard to your earliest remarks today?
Well, I think a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing because we can sell it in a way where it can be used to inflame. I can talk about the British Empire in Ireland in a way that can inflame people's sentiment about empire. If I do that without paying attention to the ways within which the Irish diaspora in the 1800s participated in empire in Canada, the United States, in Jamaica, in Montserrat, New Zealand, and Australia, by discovering, check it out, we might be Irish, but we're white when we leave here. If I don't accompany a little knowledge with some inconvenient knowledge with it, that knowledge can be used for all kinds of recruitment to terrible causes. So I suppose that's what I mean in that way. I mean, the people who were involved in the exorcisms for me claimed knowledge, and I was fool enough and also just simply young enough to believe them. And also, I would say, Catholic enough. I'd grown up in a religion that said recognition of authority, of the priest, of the bishop, of the pope, and also of anybody in religious leadership. That's what you do. You don't sit back and think, well, I've got an opinion about that. That's what Protestants do. And I thought, I'm going to be a good Catholic. And so therefore, I gave submission in a certain sense to those environments, and that was really dangerous to do. And people claimed to have knowledge, but deeper than that, they had knowledge that if you can say something confidently, a lot of people will believe you. And that's a wicked kind of knowledge, I think. There's a reason, I think, why the Garden of Eden fantasizes about a tree where you have the knowledge of good and evil, because what we know over and over again is how difficult it can be to tell them from each other. It's nice and easy to think that wickedness arrives in and says, hello, my name is wickedness, or you can call me Lucifer if you like. I'm here to lead you all astray and into genocide and terror. Wickedness is not as straightforward as that. Wickedness is a subtle and terrible thing. And the question as to what kind of knowledge we need to know how to discern that is a fruit I'd eat.
Thank you. I want to read a question from Emily Schroeder. This is always the difficult one, I would think. If there's one poem that you would hope people can connect or relate to in your life, or that could help them in their life, what would it be?
Oh, Lord. That's like asking me my favorite child. They're all my favorite child. I suppose partly one of the things that happens in art is that I have moved away from writing poems for people. I write them because they need to be written. And so a different poem means a different thing to me at different times. And sometimes people will come up to me and mention a poem of mine that they love. And it might be a poem that I thought was weak or wasn't doing the best work. And they might say it met them at a particular time. And what moves me is that they have added to the meaning of that poem, not me. And by their generous reading and by their attention, and also reading with the story of their life, it turns it into something. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize when it comes to the question of art, that the meaning of a poem changes over and over, and that it is the readers of a poem change it by their attention and by the ways that they live with it or object to it. And that, I suppose, is one of the reasons why I tend not to think about a favorite poem, because who am I to know?
Thank you. There's another question from an anonymous attendee. You mentioned how loneliness, boredom, and anger influenced your poetry. What do you think about the relationship between these more negative emotions and states and art? Do you think art could exist without conflict?
Yeah. Well, first, I'd maybe push back a little bit and question what the word negative means there. I'm not sure they are negative. I think they're true. The question is how do you live with them? There's a lot of things to be angry about. And I don't fantasize that there was ever an existence of humanity where anger wasn't part of it or won't be part of it. And the question is how am I going to live with what angers me? How am I going to live with what bores me and the boredom of my own self? And how also am I going to live with the question of my own loneliness? And so I suppose all of these things ultimately are things that offer an invitation for self-reflection. And that is one of the places where art happens. Art happens, I think, in a medium of control and chaos. And these experiences of boredom, of loneliness, of anger, of deep and profound envy, all of these things are invitations to reflect on the self. And I suppose that one of the things to do there in the space of chaos is to think, what can I create? That apparently is what God did in the space of chaos, thought, I'm going to make a universe. Apparently, that's what the poets say. And I think it's not a bad way to begin. And certainly, like the Vatican came out the other day with some ridiculous language about same-sex relationships and them not being blessed. And I mean, there would have been a period in my life where I would have read that document over and over again and learned parts of it off by heart in order to stoke the fire of my anger. But I'm not interested in giving them that kind of power. So I wrote an erasure poem from it because I thought I'm much more interested in creating as a response to that than I am being controlled by the chaos that they're not willing to pay attention to in themselves.
I love that co-opting, transforming what would be the anger into your creative act. Another anonymous question. Someone would love to hear you explain how you discovered, developed, and maintained your reading voice. They say Pádraig has such a calming, almost meditative voice, despite the trauma and the conflict that you have experienced.
Well, first, it's just my voice. Yeah, so that's the ultimate answer. I wrote poems for years and years and years, and I'd lived away overseas for 5 years. And when I was moving back to Ireland, I was moving back in quite a broken way, really. There was a whole variety of things that hadn't worked out. And I was out of high school or secondary school for 10 years. I hadn't been able to afford to go to university. I felt like, my God, where's my life going? And I moved back to Ireland, having vowed that I'd never move back to Ireland. And one of the things that I thought I was going to do was to find a poetry community. And I looked around and heard of this poetry gathering that was meeting in the basement of a bar just on the north side of Dublin. And so I was living in Dublin and I started to go there. And I was petrified each time to read a poem. You'd get there early and you'd sign your name up and you'd have maximum of 5 minutes. And I'd go up and I'd be shaking. And it was almost like some act of public confession. And people started to come up to me afterwards saying, I love your voice. And I was like, I don't know what you're on about. You're clearly listening to somebody else, so you've mistaken me. But I suppose I think of the possibility of using the voice and its cadences. I think of that as a way within which you can lodge emotion. And the longer I've read poetry, the more I think that the words themselves can be allowed to be given resonance. Irish language poetry makes a lot of use of assonance, which is elongated vowel sounds. And I suppose that influences the way I read. For a while, I used to listen to poetry being read in Farsi. I speak no Farsi, but I loved the hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of year old tradition of intoning poetry in Farsi. So I used to listen to that, thinking, not that I wanted to mimic that, but thinking I wanted to have the confidence to let the music of poetry be music.
Thank you. I love the quote from Rumi: "Poems are the rough notation for the music that we are."
Oh,
Yeah.
lovely. I don't know that one.
Yeah. There's a question here from Charlene Fix in the chat. In the two instances that you mentioned, the assault on the road and the man at the bar, you posited an utterly disarming honesty as defense. Is it fair to see these as a kind of metaphor for poetry itself?
Yeah, I think so, because one of the things I think poetry and any art invites us to is to go beneath technique, to go beneath sophistication, and to think, what am I feeling? No, actually, what's beneath that? No, actually, what's beneath that? What do I worry about? And that's a frightening thing, because in certain situations you can be faced with things that are very worrying and very frightening. But I think that is one of the invitations that poetry asks, not to be clever with language, but to go deep with it. And by going deep, I don't mean to use kind of off-putting metaphors that shroud your emotional life in distance, but really can get to the heart of the matter. And that will always involve a little bit of surgery to get to the heart.
I'm a few more questions. There's many, but we have a time for a few more. Here's one from an anonymous attendee. You speak highly of your connection with faith and your queer identity. How did you reconcile that relationship? And then they go on to say, I've been struggling to reconnect with my faith after connecting with my identity.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I have reconciled them, in the sense that I suppose what is true is that I'm a gay man. And what is true is that religion is a power in the world, and religion has regularly been on the wrong side of all kinds of emancipatory necessities in the world. I despise that song Amazing Grace, because, you know, the story is told about this person who eventually, after having gotten relatively rich, I think, wrote this song when they realized how wrong they were. Dear God, that's just a basic beginning point. I don't think that's something to be celebrated. Holy God, how long had he lived before it took him to arrive at that bloody awful economy that he was propagating? So I mean, I don't call myself a Christian. I'm certainly hugely interested in the questions of God. And I'm on my third degree in theology at the moment, and I'm sure I'll do more. So I definitely am a person who pays a lot of attention to religion. I pray, and I have all kinds of practices, but I'm uninterested in belonging to a little group that says, here's the borders, here's what belief looks like, here's what it's not, here's what at least a certain amount of certitude towards a God looks like. I utterly reject those forms of knowledge, because I think they have been proven over millennia to be profoundly sectarian in their imagination. I believe in being interested in the world. And one of the ways of being interested in the world is to ask the question of God. And I ask that through the particularity of being a man, being white, being Irish, being gay. And those things sometimes confront me with my own power, and sometimes confront me with my own pain. And that, for me, is a way to live with art. So I suppose that's how I hold all those things together. I had to take almost every piece of power I had given religion back, because I had been so bruised and damaged and torn apart, really, by religion, that I realized I was wasting my time a religion like Christianity that has a certain obsessive relationship with crucifixion, I think needs to examine the way within which it posits powerlessness as somehow virtuous, when what I see is that powerlessness has often been exploited by large groupings of people. And I don't just mean religion, I also mean empire. I also mean big sports groups. I also mean Hollywood. My God, it's difficult for lots of people to be in Hollywood. So large groupings like that often extol powerlessness, saying, "Oh my God, isn't that amazing?" But actually, they also manipulate it. And I really resist the ideas of those manipulations.
Pádraig, this has been such a rich hour with you. In that beautiful early poem of yours, Mother Tongue, you said we had no verb for love. And I feel all your poems and your being, your presence has created a whole grammar, a new grammar for love.
Oh, that's so kind. Thanks very much.
So on behalf of all of us, both here in Northeast Ohio and reaches around the country, I want to thank you for the quality of your voice and your presence, and for the beautiful poems you've shared with us today.
Oh, thank you. I thought I'd finish with one short one, if that's okay.
Thank you.
I do like science fiction, and I love films that deal with parallel universes. And so here is a poem that is imagining a parallel universe where there was a slightly older Pádraig who found a portal that he could go through to speak to a slightly younger Pádraig, could only say one thing. It's called The One Thing. There must have been some other me who lived some other time, who realized he knew the one thing that would save me. And he must have found a little window, opened it and shouted through it, that saving sound that saved me. And he must have felt a failure, I am sure, that other me, because he failed. He did. He didn't save me from the other things that beat me. And he must have sat like some sad god from sadder scriptures and wept at all he failed to do. He had so little time. And all my life, I've been climbing up to little windows, opening them and saying the one thing I can say. Thank you. Thanks to everybody for coming along and for your kind questions. I really appreciate your being here. I wish we were in the same room so we could drink tea and talk afterwards.
Thank you, Pádraig. For those of you interested in our next event, we're bringing Naomi Shihab-Nye on April 7th. And we encourage you to sign up at events.travelingstanzas.com. And thank you, Pádraig, for such a rich